We've got quite a lot to do today, so maximum concentration, and there are going to be lots of questions in the QCM on what we're doing today. Just one thing, I can't come next Monday. I have to go to Germany for work. So we're trying to find a time on the 23rd of November. And I don't know when it is, but you'll have a message to say when it is. The 23rd of November, we'll do a sort of introduction to English civil law and the trust. And hopefully today we'll finish constitutional law, but if we don't, then we'll finish it on the 23rd, okay? So are we ready? Okay. Good. So the first point, in a short introduction to the subject, which you know already, but I'll just repeat it again, is that the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution, number one. Number two, does not have entrenched constitutional rights, which are written into a single legal document. So no written constitution, no entrenched rights. There is perhaps one qualification that you can make to that statement, which is that the common law probably protects the most basic rights and freedoms. And the courts could probably prevent or decide that legislation which took away those fundamental rights and freedoms is illegal. But I've used the conditional tense because we don't have any strong authority. We just have a number of judicial statements and academic writings which tell us that. It's an important point because we're moving into an uncertain period with the possibility of withdrawal from the European Union, possibly withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights, and possibly the creation of a new Bill of Rights. But all of that is up in the air. And this probably explains why the courts at the highest level in the last few years have been making these pronouncements to remind the government that there are limits. Limits because the constitutional principle that we have lived with since 1689 is the concept of supremacy of Parliament. The idea that no Parliament can bind its successors. So any future Parliament is free to abrogate any law and make new law. And we've already discussed the tensions that that principle has created with our membership of the European Union. And I won't say any more about that now. So that was just a few introductory remarks of a general nature. To be a little more precise now, the sources of constitutional law there are five. So the first one is common law. Second is legislation. Third, European Union law. International law. Insofar as it has been integrated into our system. And last one is, or are, the conventions of the Constitution. In brackets, conventions of the Constitution are not strictly law, but they represent the practice of the main institutions of the country: government, parliament, and judiciary. What we have is what has been called an unsettled constitution, a flexible system. Which can be changed at any time by a simple majority in Parliament. No special procedures, no constitutional court. When I say no constitutional court, I mean in the sense of, for example, the German Constitutional Court or the French Constitutional Court, which have a very precise role in the constitutions of those two countries. Again, in parenthesis, of course, the UK Supreme Court carries out the function of deciding whether legislation is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, and, as we'll see in a minute, defines the common law rules of the Constitution and interprets legislation. So we have a Supreme Court that has a constitutional role, but it's not quite the same as a specially designated court that you find in other countries. A few words about history. The powers, the legal powers to govern, to legislate, to adjudicate, which we call the prerogative powers. Originally vested and still vested in the crown, the monarch, but today exercised in practice by central government, Parliament and the royal courts. Derived from customary common law. That was quite a long sentence, wasn't it? I'll try and repeat it again, but it might not come out quite the same. So, the powers to govern, to legislate, to adjudicate, which we call prerogative powers, which were vested in the monarch and are now exercised by the government, by Parliament, by the courts, derived from customary common law. The practice arose very early, before William of Normandy came to England, for the monarch to discuss government, legislation, adjudication with the nobility. And in particular, of course, to begin with, this concerned the king's relationships with his nobles who were paying the medieval equivalent of taxes. And gradually that debate, that discussion, which was held in the King's Council, spun off into the institutions that we know today, central government, Parliament, and royal courts. So if we look at the situation today, we have the Queen's ministers, led by the Prime Minister, who govern. The Parliament, which is partly elected, which legislates, and royal courts that are sitting in a separate place and independent, doing justice. You remember, because we talked about it at the beginning, that the link between the monarch and the people is based on a promise to uphold the law and the customs. The courts determine the existence, the nature and extent of the prerogative powers at common law. So much for the let's say the national sources of law. We will look in a moment in a little more detail about legislation and what constitutional legislation there is. I suppose if you look at European and international law, the most important source is the treaties of the European Union, the Charter of Fundamental Rights at the European level, and the European Convention on Human Rights, and the United Nations Charter. All of these documents contain detailed declarations about fundamental rights and freedoms. And they all echo principles that you will find in our constitutional legislation, Magna Carta, a word about Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention, I think you can describe it as a complement to legal sources. It's filling in the gaps to some extent, but it's not derived from a legal source. It's derived from the practice of the institutions. And one of the reasons why we have these conventions is that we do not have a formal separation of powers. The main conventions of the Constitution are, firstly, that the monarch will only exercise her formal legal powers. The monarch will only exercise her formal legal powers with the advice of the government. In executive matters, and with the advice and consent of Parliament in legislative matters. If you want me to repeat anything, just say. Second convention is that the Prime Minister and ministers are appointed by the monarch from the party which holds the majority in the Commons, the House of Commons. And sometimes it's a coalition. We had a coalition government for a few years recently. So it could be two parties who are joined together in a coalition. A third convention is that tax legislation I should say primary tax legislation, is voted by the Commons and not the House of Lords. Fourthly, legislation is assented to by the monarch after it has passed through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Parliament is dissolved on the advice of the Prime Minister. But this will only occur during the course of a fixed term of 5 years for each Parliament, in circumstances that are now defined by legislation. The Prime Minister decides national policy in cabinet with the ministers. And there was some concern during the latter part of the Blair administration. Blair, B-L-A-I-R, that Cabinet was not being consulted. The Prime Minister and ministers are collectively responsible to the Parliament and should resign in the event of a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. There's probably a new convention, which is that Parliament is consulted on the engagement of UK armed forces in foreign conflict. And this explains why UK armed forces are not directly engaged in Syria at the moment. And this was a reaction to the second Gulf War, where the government took the country into armed conflict in circumstances that were debatable from a legal point of view. Last convention that we should mention is that the exercise of judicial power is carried out independently by the royal courts without any interference or comment from the executive or the parliament. One last thing in the introduction. Royal charters. Royal charters have played an important role in our constitutional history. The most famous one, of course, is Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215. The Magna Carta started life as an agreement between the monarch, the king, and his nobles. And then was transformed into legislation in 1225. And I think we're celebrating 800 years of Magna Carta this year. And there are still, I think, at least three sections of Magna Carta that are on the statute book. One of them confirms the ancient rights of the City of London to hold markets. Are we all okay up to now? Anything you want me to go back on? Yeah.
I don't understand. You said one of them concerned I don't know, right?
Just in the last sentence?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the sections in Magna Carta concerns the rights of the City of London to hold markets. And yeah.
Does that mean that there could be no stock exchange in any other city in the UK?
Not necessarily. The idea was that the City of London could organise its business and markets and trade without royal interference. And I can't remember whether they had to pay something for the privilege, but they probably did. But what is important in that is that there is a very long-standing tradition of independence and freedom of the City of London, and that explains, it's one of the things that explains why the City of London is still a very powerful business and financial centre, because it's always enjoyed this relative independence. Of course, there have been ups and downs, more regulation recently because of the excesses in the financial market, but that's another story. So I'm moving on now to a second chapter, if you like, of this this section on constitutional law, and this deals with the prerogative powers of government. So what we'll do is we'll look at successively prerogative powers of government, then legislative powers, and then judicial powers. Then go on to look at substantive constitutional rights and the enforcement of constitutional rights, procedural rights. So turning to prerogative powers of government, first of all, these are now mainly exercised in the name of the monarch by ministers, including the Prime Minister. You will probably find, if you look at constitutional law books or cases, that there are references to the Crown. And when we talk about the Crown, we mean the monarch and the executive, one or the other. The prerogative power to govern has been described as the residue of discretionary, arbitrary authority. So the residue of discretionary, arbitrary authority legally vested in the Crown. And those powers today, or the prerogative powers of the government today, are as follows. Firstly, executive government. Secondly, foreign relations and treaties. Thirdly, defense and the secret services. I can't resist saying it's appropriate that we're in room 007, the week that the new James Bond comes out. It's coming out this week. But if you look at James Bond, it probably refers to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, licensed to kill. And I say this every year, it's actually a correct statement of the common law, that the members of the armed forces and the secret services are authorized to kill the Queen's enemies as necessary. Fourth power is the maintenance of law and order, known as the Queen's Peace. And all police officers, individually, are vested with a power to keep order and to arrest any person breaching the peace. And that power is actually shared with the citizens. All citizens have the power to arrest a person breaching the peace. We call it the citizen's arrest. I actually had to do it once. I won't tell you the story now because it's a bit too long, maybe at the break. Fifth power is the power to protect citizens, particularly children and persons under an incapacity. Sixth is declaring war and peace. Seventh is assenting to bills. And that is actually exercised by the monarch. The eighth is the dissolution of Parliament. That is again the Queen who exercises that power. The eighth is the appointment and dismissal of ministers. Again, the Queen, on the advice of the Prime Minister. The issue of passports. The management of the civil service, which is now regulated by statute. Last two are the honours, the UK equivalent of the Légion d'honneur, and that is the Queen, again on the advice of the government and her advisors. And the last one is the royal pardon, the prerogative of mercy. Sorry, one more, last one, the prosecution of criminal offences. Prosecution of criminal offences. If you look at criminal cases in English cases, you will find that the proceedings are brought by the Queen against the person accused. So it's R, or Regina, versus the accused. And the prosecution is in the hands today of the Attorney General, who is in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service. We've talked about that before. There are a couple of important precedents in this connection, in connection with the royal prerogative of government. The first is the case of proclamations in 1611, case of proclamations 1611, which said that the courts determine the existence, nature, and extent of the prerogative And Lord Justice Coke, C-O-K-E, said that the king had no prerogatives beyond those flowing from the common law. And the case of proclamations was a town planning case, urbanisme in French, town planning. And the king was trying to organise town planning in London through proclamations. And when this was challenged, as I said, the courts said that the king could not govern by proclamation. The principle was reiterated in a case called Council of Civil Service Unions versus the Minister for the Civil Service in 1984. Council of Civil Service Unions versus Minister for the Civil Service, 1984, decision of the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. And that was an important case because it also said that executive action was not immune from judicial review merely because it was carried out in pursuance of a power derived from common law. That was a case about legitimate expectations of a union which was being deprived of the right to strike by government action, by government decision. So that's all I've got to say about prerogative powers of government. So I'd like to move on, if there are no questions, difficulties, to talk about legislative powers. So a new heading, legislative powers. First of all, history and the constitutional position. Parliament in the form we now know appeared in the 14th century with representation. Of the Lord's spiritual, in other words, the bishops, and temporal, and today that means hereditary peers and life peers, and the commons. The commons in the 14th century were representing the shires, S-H-I-R-E-S, the shires, the counties, a bit like the département in France. Shires, S-H-I-R-E-S, okay? And the boroughs, B-O-R-O-U-G-H, borough, derived, of course, from the French bourg. The Bill of Rights in 1688 established that the monarch could not suspend laws or Parliament or raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. It also confirmed the right of subjects to petition the king. The principle of free election of members of Parliament. Freedom of speech in Parliament. And lastly, the regular holding of Parliament. This was important because the king had suspended Parliament on a number of occasions during the 17th century. So in the 17th century, the Parliament established its supremacy over the Crown. And the prevalence of the advice of a Prime Minister supported by a majority in Parliament. A few words about legislation which affects Parliament. We now have a Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2010, which creates a fixed term of 5 years, which can only be shortened by a vote of a qualified majority of the House of Commons. The Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949 established the principle that the House of Lords cannot indefinitely block legislation voted by the House of Commons. Since 1918, the House of Commons, or the members of the House of Commons, are elected by universal direct suffrage. Universal direct suffrage under the Representation of the People Acts. Representation of the People Acts. 1918 and 1928. 1928 introduced the right of women to vote. And the Act of 1918 abolished property qualifications for voters. Before 1918, you had to be a property owner to vote. So that was abolished in the Representation of the People Act, 1918. In 1999, the House of Lords Act provided for progressive abolition of hereditary peers. Peers, P-E-E-R-S, peers. And the question of an elected upper house has been on the table now for some time. A few points now concerning the ultimate control of the common law over legislation. We have cases dating from 1610 and 1615, respectively, Dr. Bonham's case, B-O-N-H-A-M, Dr. Bonham's case, and another case called Day, like night, versus Savage, S-A-V-A-D-G-E, Day versus Savage, S-A-V-A-D-G-E. And those cases stated the principle that acts of Parliament may be void at common law if they are against common right and reason. Common right and reason. repugnant, impossible to be performed, or against natural equity. Now, those two cases were thought to have been overtaken by the Bill of Rights. And we now seem to have gone full circle with recent constitutional developments, the introduction of European Union law, the Human Rights Act, but that remains an open question. Last point on the question of legislative powers, just a few words about Parliament as a court. I hesitated about including it just here, but I thought as we were talking about the Parliament, it was a moment just to mention this, that from the earliest times, Parliament was also a court. To which petitions could be addressed by the people. So part of the business of the Parliament was dealing with disputes. Disputes raising important questions, and I suppose to some extent you could say they would be raising points about which perhaps legislation might be required. But the judicial function of the Parliament was preserved until 2009. Until 1851. Until 1851, the whole of the House of Lords could sit to decide appeals. From 1851, it was decided that only a committee of senior judges would be appointed to the House of Lords to deal with final appeals. So that was called the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, which survived until 2009, and which was functionally and legally independent of the House of Lords as a political chamber. So the creation of the Supreme Court in 2009 did not really change very much. It was just felt that it was better to have the final Court of Appeal in a modern state, sitting outside the Parliament and not inside the Parliament. So the judges from the appellate committee of the House of Lords just moved across Parliament Square into a new building. Okay. So if you want to have 5 minutes break, 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, please, then I will start. I'm counting. I will start in 5 minutes.